Hello, everyone. I'm Karen Nathan, a board member of Floridians for Democracy. Welcome. These are troubling times for democracy. What has been happening in our country is truly frightening to me, and maybe it is to many of you as well. When we see something really bad happening, human nature makes us want to look away. We don't really want to see it. We don't want to face it. Many of us have not wanted to watch the news. We don't want to read the newspapers. And unfortunately, in some cases, we've stopped donating to organizations that we've donated to, and we know we should keep donating to them. But it's like some kind of PTSD, paralyzing stupor thing comes over us. And I feel like there's this line in an old movie by Cher where she says, we just have to snap out of it. Snap out of it. We must engage. We must become aware of what is happening so we can push back against it to save our democracy. I believe our speaker tonight will help us do that.
Great, thanks, Karen. I am Karen's assistant, Jim Nathan, and on behalf of the Board of Directors for Floridians for Democracy Institute, which is our 501c3 education arm, and Floridians for Democracy, our 501c4, which is focused on advocacy, so the C3 is on education. We want to welcome you to our very first program for 2025. Our effort began in early 23 out of the vision of that person you just heard from, my wife, Karen, a lifetime educator. We initially referred to our effort as the 1939 Project. Today, we have nearly 1,200 FFD participants around Florida, focused on helping to preserve and protect democracy, which in Florida is a huge challenge, as many of us know. I used to refer to Florida as the canary in the democracy coal mine. I now fear that Florida's canary is on life support, and the nation is now the canary in the democracy coal mine. So I have just some brief instructions, and then I have the opportunity to introduce our special speaker tonight. The instructions for this evening: to minimize distractions with such a large audience, you'll only be able to see the speakers and yourself. Your mics will remain muted. You'll be able to submit questions through the Zoom chat down at the bottom. Your questions will go directly to FFD board member and co-founder Bill Petrarca, who will synthesize your questions for the Q&A period to ask of our impressive presenter. And now it's my pleasure to share with you that Scott Harshbarger has had an impressive life journey. My comments won't be as long as his, but I wanted to cover some things so you get a good flavor for this special person. He's like a gift that keeps on giving. From a 3-sport high school athlete to a Harvard College football halfback who was practicing for the big game against Yale when he learned of JFK's assassination, to a 1-year fellowship at the Union Theological Seminary before entering Harvard Law. Scott even served as a chaplain and professor of religious studies at Penn State, and we could use some good chaplaining today. He served as a public defender, civil rights attorney, district attorney, 2 terms as Massachusetts Attorney General. And while he was Attorney General, he was recognized nationally by being elected to be the president of the National Association of Attorneys General. He was one of the very first attorney generals to sue tobacco manufacturers on behalf of children and public health. He was a pioneer in pursuing handgun safety regulations. And following nearly being elected governor of Massachusetts, Scott served 3 years as the national president of Common Cause, an important bipartisan government and corporate watchdog. To demonstrate Scott's bipartisan credentials, can you remember an era when bipartisanship was actually vogue? For 7 years, Scott teamed up with Morning Joe on Fox of all places. No, not the current Morning Joe, but with Scott's friend, former Republican State Treasurer Joe Malone, talking sports on Monday mornings on Boston's local Fox. He also chaired former Republican Governor Mitt Romney's Commission on Corrections Reform. Scott and wife Judy have 5 adult children and 10 grandchildren. He presently serves as senior counsel at Kasner and Edwards, routinely appears on television as a commentator and news analyst, has authored numerous articles on corporate and nonprofit governance, and remains involved in public policy reform. Sometime he gets to see his grandchildren, though. I was recently introduced to Scott by a Floridians for Democracy supporter. In our initial discussion, I learned about the organization he co-founded after the first Trump election, Lawyers Defending American Democracy, or LDAD. Many of you in attendance tonight are affiliated with LDAD, and that's helped our attendance immeasurably. During our discussion about the current national political landscape, Scott shared that our nation is sleepwalking into autocracy. Wow, I thought, and I immediately asked if he would do an educational program for us, never dreaming that we would exceed over 800 registrants for tonight. While not all will be on here, we're thrilled to have so many. Scott will speak for about 25 minutes, then open up for Q&A. And please use the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Floridians board member Bill Petrarca will be monitoring the chat, which will go directly to him. And then following Scott's comments, we will use the remaining time for you to pose questions for his response. So let's all learn and let's all grow from Scott Harshbarger. Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim and Karen. I don't know if I'm going to be seen on this or continue to see you.
No, you are seen by everyone.
Okay, because I'm having the opportunity to look directly at you and Karen and a group of other people, but that is perfectly fine. I'm glad to see so many people here. Let me first of all just
300, Scott. You're well over 300. So you got it.
Let me just thank you for inviting me to Floridians for Democracy and for the work that you are doing. I also want to thank very much so many people who have responded. I like to think that's because of my likely eloquence or lack thereof, or substance, but I have a feeling that we have a time when in this nation, people need to communicate. People need to engage. In the words of John Gardner, the founder of Common Cause, democracy is not a spectator sport. In the words of John Lewis, if not now, when? If not us, who? This is a time for engagement. It's a time for participation. It's a time for coming off the sidelines and addressing the issues collectively. Now, it's easier said than done, and I do not in any way underestimate the impact of what has been occurring, but I do want to start by, first of all, thanking so many of you who have supported Lawyers Defending American Democracy for now on 6 years. When we first founded this, my co-founder was Gary Rotner, a Harvard Law School classmate of mine. Our executive director, Lauren Raclean, who was a former Boston Bar Association president, and a board that has worked diligently over these years to try to figure out how to mobilize the legal profession in particular to confront and to preserve and protect our democracy. I simply have to say at this point that the stunning silence of the leaders of our profession, the deans of law schools, the heads of many bar associations, the heads of major law firms, and their participants have remained on the sidelines. And as John Gardner once said, who gave us, we lawyers who have taken an oath to preserve and protect the Constitution and the laws of this country, who gave us the privilege to do that? Who gave us the right to stay on the sidelines. And that may well speak to all of us as citizens at this point in time. My plan this evening, as difficult as Zoom is, and I'm sure is difficult for you as well, because I can't get a sense necessarily of how you're reacting or what you want to respond to. I thought I would try to provide some outline, some headlines, if you will. And setting my alarm right now, which I have the ability to do, I hope, on my iPhone, which my neighbors may question whether I do have that ability or not, given my technological disabilities. I would want to go to questions and answers, because I think that this is an opportunity for me to address issues that I have not addressed that you have in mind. I am very interested in what you're thinking about and how you're thinking about it at this point in time as well. And I think it can be a very particularly interesting process. And so that's what that will be my goal. And when the alarm goes off, if not before, then we will go to that. And I'll certainly have plenty of time after that, when in response to questions, to make any points that I felt were missed or to some extent misunderstood. I start this headline piece with a very simple statement that may or may not be true for all of you, but for me, the way I look at this is that in my lifetime, this is the greatest challenge to the rule of law and democracy that I have encountered. I happen to have been a young lawyer, and I see many others who once were a young lawyer with me, like Alan Rogers and others who are joined us today. In the 1968 to 1975 period of Vietnam, civil rights, Watergate, the Saturday Night Massacre, for those of you old enough to remember, and many of you maybe only has read about that. But in that period, as a young lawyer, I had the opportunity to see mentors, partners in law firms, an attorney general, Frank Bellotti, that I worked for as well, serve as role models for standing up, not as Republicans or Democrats, liberals or conservatives, but as lawyers who had taken an oath of office to preserve and protect the Constitution, to stand up as an independent profession and take the position that these things shall not stand. And it was something that I will never forget, to see that kind of leadership by my mentors, if you will. It certainly influenced an entire generation of mine, not only legal services attorneys like Gary and others, but those of us that had the privilege to be public defenders or civil rights attorneys, or had the opportunity then to serve in the Attorney General's office in Massachusetts under a leader who stressed that our job was to make decisions on the facts and the law, and that the key piece to all of this was that the rule of law mattered more than any political issue. And that was our charge. And I also saw how that worked, actually, not in Elon Musk style, but I saw it as a way it revolutionized the performance of many public law offices. It changed the dynamic in terms of how people saw the law. It influenced legislators that we believed that the rule of law mattered. Today, as many commentators have mentioned, many columnists have as well, often not quite enough, that our choice is very clear. Are we going to support the rule of law, or are we going to support the law of the ruler? I also want to stress that while I wanted to have this disclosed here, I am a Democrat. I was the son of a minister, born in central Pennsylvania. It was, thanks to Jim, I appreciated the title, but my father was the chaplain and professor of religious studies at Penn State. But my role as a lawyer and now with Lawyers Defending American Democracy is, I believe, totally nonpartisan. We are not only a non-for-profit, but as I said in the time when we thought about creating Lawyers Defending American Democracy at my 50th reunion at Harvard Law School, the position was, if you support equal protection, due process, First Amendment, civility, decency, integrity in the legal system, that's not an ideology. That's not liberal or conservative. That is the core, those are the core principles of our democracy. They are the core norms and values that influence our democracy. And in that vein, what we are now learning is, I hope, and have been learning for the last few years, they are not self-enforcing. These norms and values and principles that we take, many respects, take for granted, and frankly, that Alexis de Tocqueville highlighted in Democracy in America in the early 1810 to 15 period that he did his 2 volumes. What he highlighted was the community, the participation of citizens in their civil society, that it was the civil society that served as the foundation of our democracy. It was on top of that that our founders built in the checks and balances, the separation of powers that has, while sometimes been inefficient, sometimes inconvenient, has in fact been the center that is the foundation of our democracy. They are, as Derek Bach has often said at Harvard, the constraints that keep us free. And the danger is today, as it was, as I recall, in 1968, and Ken Burns, in fact, did one section on 1968, and the title of it was the W.B. Yeats quote, "Things fall apart, the center will not hold." And it is the center that these institutions of democracy are the foundation. It is these institutions that today are being, in my view, fundamentally attacked by those who, I think it's important to underline, who fairly won a democratic election. The person who won with respect was also the person who, on January 6, 2021, was the first president in our history to seek to overturn a peaceful transition of power. But be that as it may, and there are many, many things that come from that, and we need to think about how that happened, how it is that we handle that. But that person has been elected our president. And what we're seeing, I think it is fair to say, is not only a flood of an effort to impose a new dimension to government. Some people call it a hostile takeover. I happen to believe, along with Robert Hubble, that you call a coup by its name when you're fundamentally trying to change this. But change is not itself bad. Disruption is not in and of itself bad. Many of us as reformers, whether as legal services attorneys, public defenders, assistant attorneys general, or in law firms, or in anything we've done, challenging the status quo, seeking reform of institutions, is healthy. It's important to do. It's important to do. But the key ingredient in a democracy, in a constitutional democracy, a republic, is to do it within the bounds of the law. And we are now seeing, in our opinion at Lawyers Defending American Democracy, and the opinion of many people, an effort to fundamentally change and attack and destroy parts of government. And that may well be a possibly legitimate exercise. I don't agree with it. Many of the policies we don't, but this is not about policy. That's what I want to stress today. This is about the rule of law. This is about adhering to the checks and balances of our system. This very delicately embedded system of courts and Congress and the executive in balancing each other to achieve the goals of our democracy. The actions that have been taken in the last 25 days, Karen mentioned it at the introduction, but I want to make one point before this. The president told us this is what he was going to do. That is, in many respects, one of the reasons some people I have heard support this is he's only doing what he said he was going to do. He said he was going to do these things, and he's keeping his promises, unlike, in their view, many other politicians who make promises and don't succeed, don't take them on. The problem here, I think, that we are facing is that it is being done done illegally. Agencies being eliminated that can only be technically, legally eliminated by Congress. Actions being taken regarding, for example, the Department of Justice, which I have always seen as the independent arm of justice in the executive. Actions being taken to dismiss and eliminate prosecutors who participated in the prosecution not only of the current president when he was former president, but also prosecuting the people who I believe were insurrectionists. It is hard to believe, other than with the words of, I think it was Flip Wilson or Red Fox, that was a day of love. It's like, do you believe me or your lying eyes about what occurred on that day and the actions that were taken? And even the former Attorney General has been questioned by some of us as to why actions weren't taken more aggressively, more immediately, to deal with that, to deal with essentially an armed revolution attempt, an insurrection to try to eliminate a peaceful transition of power. And even at that time, I think we need to remember and not forget that 147 members of Congress still failed to certify that election. And then you compare it to the current transition of a quite radical transition that was going to occur. And for better or for worse, we saw a Democratic president, a Democratic vice president certify a peaceful transition of power to this administration. The actions that we saw there, the pardon that occurred of 1,500 people who engaged in violent actions against our Capitol, against elected officials, the pardoning of that, yes, he said he was going to do it, and he did it. But from my experience, the fact you say you're going to commit a crime and you do it is usually not a defense to how you approach that. But that's where we are. And I think we all have some degree of concern about that. But I want to now move on to what we might do about that in the last few minutes that I have before we get to questions. Because I think it is about how do we move forward. Karen has raised it. You've all been thinking about it. Many of you have written about it in this. The Lawyers Defending American Democracy, I commend to you our website. lda.org, about our statement, about our history, about our identification of the 7 pillars of democracy that started in 2017 and 18 to be challenged by the then President Trump and his enablers. Issues of separation of power, of independence of the Department of Justice, of approaching people with dignity and respect, and a variety of other key foundational principles that we had all taken for granted, even though they weren't always implemented, as being the pillars of democracy. And it had a compendium that we talked about examples of how they had been done. We also in the last year have written and posted talking points about Project 2025 and its effort, in our view, to essentially challenge and take over government. You may or may not agree with us about that, but one of our goals was to at least try to explain to people what was occurring and why. And particularly because, in many respects, the legacy media, the way, if you will, that in 1968, 1970, it was just ABC, CBS, NBC. There were just certain legacy media, the basic legacy New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times. Today, the legacy media is being challenged all the time by social media, by other points of information that people get their information. But the legacy media in the last year demonstrated, I think, a flaw, which was they simply treated it as another campaign. Actions that were taken, what did the other side say about it? Normalizing activity that had heretofore would have been considered substantially in violation of the norms and values of our democracy. But it appears that challenging the core values, principles of democracy did not cost Donald Trump the election. In fact, one can say that democracy issue concerns about democracy were not major in terms of how people chose. The majority of our citizens appeared to find certainly other issues, inflation, immigration, whatever else their concerns were or were not, performative substance versus how the Democrats proceeded under various circumstances. But democracy was on the ballot, but it did not prevail. And that's what our challenge is, it seems to me, today. And that's why I want to go in this last piece of this to my experience, my recollection, my life, perhaps even as a public official. And the key is, how engaged will the people be? I mentioned de Tocqueville and the basis for our civil society being the key in de Tocqueville's mind to why American democracy worked. People associated with each other in their local communities. And yet today we have very little local journalism. We have very little collective participation, whether it's even on nonprofits or in local communities, which is where whether you're a Republican or a Democrat didn't matter. The issues were, how are we going to deal with local problems? How are we going to solve those problems? What is the coverage going to be? Not about whether Fox and NBC are covering each something differently, but how are we dealing with local issues? How are we handling our town meetings? How are we handling our city council? How are those issues at play? And that has been lost, and something that we may have to work hard to recapture. At the same time, I think we have also lost, at least in my perception, without these outstanding kids that happen to be my adult kids and the grandchildren, clearly far superior to anything that I was or would be. But I don't see the same degree of participation, of engagement in public issues, in government, in concerns about the kinds of things that we had to some extent drummed into us, maybe by my parents, maybe by virtue of, as somebody who was a church member of the Church of the Brethren, the social gospel, whether it was ideas about equal protection, those kind of concerns and belief that they mattered in terms of our democracy, that is being lost. And we all have a responsibility to engage and to educate as we go forward. We also have a responsibility to hold our elected officials accountable. And whether you're in a red state or a blue state, whether it's local or federal, calling your representatives, writing letters to the editor, joining small groups, participating actively in supporting causes that you believe in. But for me, and for what we've tried to do at Lawyers Defending American Democracy, is our focus has been on getting lawyers to try to come off the sidelines, to participate actively as educators with a democracy commitment, to speak out independently, not as partisans, but to make sure people understand what the implications may be or could be or are about this challenge that's occurring to our democracy. And I guess I used the term sleepwalking into autocracy, not because it was brand new, and certainly others have mentioned it. But I think we all also need to realize how quickly, how fragile our democracy may be. We say it can't happen here, but yet there are many people who do remember the 1930s. Many people who today, even an article like the 53 days that democracy died in Nazi Germany, how quickly this fragile system can be unraveled. How quickly, if people who have taken the oath of office to uphold the law and the Constitution do not treasure their responsibility, take seriously their oath to uphold the law, to uphold democracy, even if it's not politically popular or even on their minds. So some of our job is to remind people of what these principles are, why they matter, and to be engaged on a regular basis. This will not happen overnight, but we must be much more vigilant. And it's maybe easy for me to say about this. I am concerned, and it may be far too anxiety driven, that this will be over before we get out of the dugout. That we too often, not as Democrats or Republicans or conservatives or liberals, we too often bring a knife to a gunfight. We too often love to circle ourselves and shoot each other, as opposed to facing the larger issues about how we collectively influence in our local communities, in our state, and in our national government. And we are now facing that time. If it hasn't yet impacted people, those of us that feel this must begin to act. There are many, many people who apparently do not share the view that there is a major concern here, or if there is a concern, the fact is that the person saying what he was going to do, it is important in this day and age to have a strong authoritarian role at the leadership role. We have a House of Representatives that appears perfectly willing to sacrifice its prerogatives at this point, or to let an unelected designee of the president deal with the somewhat destruction, or at least the critical downsizing of government and agencies. And the Senate, in the same category, willing to nominate and confirm people who their credentials do not appear to be qualified, but have been named by this president. This is not going to go away overnight. But the other side of this is to remember what brung us. Martin Luther King said, in the end, we will not remember. There it is. I'm about to stop. We will not remember the words of our enemies, but we will remember the silence of our friends. Abraham Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, faced with the crisis that was then existing, said, tested whether this would test whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated could long endure. And John Gardner, in his continuing positive way, after founding Common Cause to try to get mobilized citizens to play the role, the most important role of the most important office in a democracy, the office of citizen, took the position that leaders and advocates have an opportunity, have golden opportunities to tackle insurmountable obstacles. And if nothing else, I think this will test all of our beliefs about democracy. It may be time for renewal in the classic way that Gardner thought about renewal, as a go back to the basics. Why does it matter? How does it affect your life? How does it affect our communities? But to go back and renew and remind ourselves, not only that we say the words, but we hear the music. And the music that we will all together as citizens provide leadership. One person can make a difference. We are, after all, a country that is governed by the consent of the governed. And that is us, my friends. In the end, it is up to us. And I commend all of you for all you have done, what you continue to do, and I urge you to stand tall. The best is yet to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott. Are you ready for some questions?
I certainly am, and I'm sure the audience is ready to ask them.
They have been asking questions for, pretty much all along. So let me give a couple to you for your input. How long do we have before the Trump-Musk MAGA wrecking ball turns the U.S. into a multi-decade autocracy or fascism?
Well, I'm sure many people have their view about that. I personally worry that it's happening. There's a reason this is happening very fast. It is happening. The actions have been planned, have been taken. Let's not kid it up. Project 2025 was a detailed analysis, 900 pages of how to tackle, and as my colleague Lauren Rickleen has said, how to tackle the destruction of government and to eliminate, for whatever reason, and this wasn't expressly there, for the billionaires, with all due respect to many of you who are billionaires on this call, to eliminate regulation, when in fact the guardrails of liberty assume that there will be a referee, assume that there will be fair play, assume that there will be checks and balances to everything we do, that capitalism survives in this country because it is not unfettered. Yes, we can need to regulate with skill, maybe with a finer hand, and certainly there are bureaucracies, but that's what any of us have done. And I look around the people that have written in, who have run organizations. Of course you affect change. Of course you try to cut and bring in new people. But you also, in order to preserve the institution, need historic memory, need and find the people that have been there, that are good people, that are skilled people, that you need to function, to keep the place going, no matter how many new people you bring in. That is the essence. So that's the process. Right now, I think one can argue that unless people get much more active directly, maybe march, maybe engage much more visibly than we have been. Do as many people like Jamie Raskin are now suggesting about launching public protests to make sure people are aware. Because then the media ask, why are you doing this? What are you doing this for? What's your goal? You can't win. Why are you doing this? Engaging people together, bringing them away from bowling alone, if you will, from the old Robert Putnam, and say, we're doing this as associations, as communities. We are in this together, and it will take time. But I also think that this is still one of the things that the law, and this is, I have to go back to my lawyer friend, the lawyers about this. So far, and it's not going to happen continually, the judiciary has once again, in my opinion, stood tall. They're making decisions on the facts and the law. You win some, you lose some. But litigation takes time. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it gives you time. It gives you time to raise issues, to educate, to mobilize if you're concerned about policy. And more importantly for me, I'm pleased to see the last couple of weeks, the American Bar Association has stepped up and stated the problem. Several bar associations are doing this. I just hope that more people will do that. Now, that doesn't mean there's a timeline. The timeline could be short, it could be long. I believe that, I guess I end up this way, I still have a huge amount of faith in our better angels. I still believe and hope with John Meacham that the majority of people in America care about the Constitution. They just don't quite understand why sometimes the challenges are to the Constitution or to the rule of law. People do understand that. Yes, we have a gap in public education, civic education. We're paying a huge price for that. But the majority, it appears, of the center, all the polling is that the majority of people from both sides want the center to hold. They do not think this is what's going on now is totally eliminating the center. We have to find ways to keep building that center. If we don't, I think the courts will, in the end, give us time. But as I mentioned earlier, and you've all probably seen the article about how democracy died in Germany. Now, granted, there was not nearly the history of expectations about the strength of our system, the strength of our economy, the strength of people here. And so I simply believe that the more we speak, the more we engage, the more we can convince at least lawyers who've taken the oath of office and elected officials who have taken an oath of office to uphold the Constitution, including the President of the United States, who now is citing Napoleon Bonaparte as his justification for avoiding this. But this cannot stand, and we have to stand and deliver. But I'm sure others of you have different, I don't know what other people think. That's my view anyway. We have time. We have time, but don't think we have, this isn't, spring training is coming, but the major league season starts in April, and we better get ready.
Okay, that's excellent. I'm going to drill down a little bit on a couple of things you said. First, I want to focus on the Supreme Court. And, you were focusing here on what has happened to the primacy of the rule of law. But help us think about a long-term strategy for protecting the rule of law, and what role will the Supreme Court, that is hyper-conservative, play in allowing us to play out a long-term strategy when it looks like that when some of these cases get to the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court may very well ratify some of these changes that the administration is trying to pull off. And that will be an authoritarian takeover by entirely legal means. What recourse do we have?
Well, I mean, that's the whole issue, isn't it? I mean, you can go back and we can all have the discussion we should have had years ago, and remind people that elections have consequences. And if you elect a president of a party who can designate Supreme Court nominees, so be it. If you can have a person in the minority that Mitch McConnell pulled, of saying that you're not going to have a nominee while I'm here, there was obstruction. But the fact is that at this point, I think we have two things. I think that the Supreme Court has created an issue by giving almost total immunity in official acts to the president. That's sort of reinforced this view that somehow all of these actions, even if they're illegal, you can't hold the president responsible. And if all these people are being delegated to do this by him, that's somehow a defense. And you don't have a Justice Department that is willing to stand up and be counted in terms of independence, and they certainly have not. But you do have, you do have state attorneys general. And while I am sorry that is mostly Democratic state attorneys general, I happen to be lucky enough to serve in a period where bipartisanship by attorneys general was the rule. That is, you were not a Republican attorney general or a Democratic attorney general functioning. You were an attorney general. And we might disagree, different policies and things of that type, but there was never this sort of Democratic attorney general and Republican attorney general, which allows the press to treat this as political gestures. It's all the Democratic attorneys general that are suing. It must be a political opportunity in a blue state. It must be because of politics, when in fact, by and large, the best I can see, attorneys general are doing this because they have standing, because they have responsibilities under their state laws to protect and preserve those state laws, even when threatened at the federal level, unless preempted. They have state courts that can function. So there is a battalion of folks there that are raising it. We don't have to necessarily say, well, it's because they're Democratic attorneys general. I wish they were many more. I cannot believe that attorneys general in many of the so-called red states are not facing the same issues on cutbacks and research, on employment, on those kind of things. But we take what we can get right now. And secondly, you're going to hopefully begin to see more attorneys engaging in litigation. But at the end of the day, the sad part here is, when is Congress, when is the House of Representatives, when are the senators going to stand up and say, we have, we don't necessarily disagree with everything you're doing or with you, but we have prerogatives. We have roles to play in this government. And I know that there's lots of money in politics issues. There's lots of money floating around and the danger. But at some point, we're entitled to a Edmund Burke statement here. Your job is to protect and preserve the Constitution and the public interest, not just your own interest or your own incumbency. And that's, again, where we as citizens have a role. These folks have to listen to you. They may make fun of you, they may not pay attention, but if we don't continue to press them, reps and senators, to do their job in the old, forgive my Massachusetts, Bill Belichick, do your job, stand up and deliver, then in a democracy, there's no, that won't work. So I do think accountability matters. Now, the Supreme Court, I'm sorry to go on so long about this, is always a tricky issue because they're not elected. There's obviously some polling that shows that the Supreme Court has lost a lot of legitimacy because of apparent ethical or conflict of interest issues and violations. And speaking of that, by the way, one of the most obvious, glaring conflicts of interest is existing right now as a matter of law in terms of Mr. Musk and DOGE making decisions that clearly affect his own financial interests with no one, the Attorney General, paying no attention to what exists in terms of conflict of interest and that kind of thing. But again, we're going to have to face that and just have to keep calling it out, I think. And not because, again, not because it's a Republican, not because we're calling it out because it's illegal. They're easy to solve. Congress, step up, get rid of USAID, get rid of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, get rid of education, but take a vote, stand and deliver, be held accountable. Like the Supreme Court, we don't have the same, but on the other hand, I do believe, and this may be really naive, my wife, who's really the attorney in the family, does not agree with me about this, that there is a chance that John Roberts and a couple members of that court will, on this issue of the rule of law, stand tall and hold the line so that it's not completely eliminated as a viable check and balance on the executive. But that may be my pipe dream.
Pipe dream and hope and prayer, maybe. I want to drill down a little more further. You had mentioned that you felt that some of the billionaires were behind this autocracy movement. Is that a fair statement? I mean, is that
Yes.
a fair statement of your opinion?
Yes, but I mean, I should say it because I've been heavily influenced by John McCain, by Bill Moyers, by the entire Common Cause, soft money, campaign finance reform effort that McCain, Russ Feingold, Chris Shays, and Marty Meehan led, which we then, looks back in hindsight, we deal with soft money. That now Citizens United comes along. And it is clear now that as Bill Moyers, I still think that this is a prescient statement by him, that he always felt, and you may have heard him speak many times, but Bill Moyers said that he thought the greatest threat for America and our security would not come from outside, that we would rally about that, whether it's 9/11 or something. The greatest threat would be when our civic worth was measured by our net worth. And that was from within. That was the pogo thing. Look at the enemy and see yourself. And here, I still think, is the issue with the money in politics issue. I noticed, it was not hard to notice, that certain senators who people were sure would not vote to confirm certain nominees were the targets of dramatic funding of ads in their district. The social media hit. Let's remember, a lot of this is social media. We sit out here, and I'm not one to deal with it, but we sit out here acting like, at what point should we start using social media? I mean, what is this, that the other side gets to do it all? And I apologize for that statement. I don't know how to do it, but I think the answer was that money And then even now, we have seen examples, which I am shocked that the media is not covering even more, even though I think this is classic. I'm jumping ahead of you here. This is obeying in advance. We're seeing Bezos do it. We're seeing many of the corporate leaders obeying in advance and not participating in this process. Mr. Musk uses his money when he's criticized. He uses his X account. And to some extent, we have to, maybe he can do that. I think there's a conflict of interest, but he does own X and can use it. Well, we have to figure out ways, I hope, to try to counter that. But I do think that the impact of the billionaires in this particular administration is very real. But I don't want to get too sanctimonious about that, because one of the things that the Democrats succeeded in doing over the last 25 years was to collect substantial monies from very wealthy people who had interest in supporting Democratic candidates. I think there are false equivalencies going on here, but this is particularly dramatic. And as long as Citizens United exists, unless till the Congress wants to deal with that, we face the fact that if you have a lot of money, you can do what Bill Moyers was worried about greatly. Your civic worth will in fact be measured by your net worth.
Good. So we have a couple more questions here. Representative Raskin has suggested a class action suit by those of us whose information is being illegally accessed by the Department of what government, the DOGE. Does Mr. Harshbarger have some thoughts on that? And does anyone know if such a suit is in the works?
The answer is I agree with Representative Raskin about this and other steps that he is taking. And I say it, not only I happen to know Jamie Raskin, respect him greatly. I met him long before he became a Democratic congressman and Democratic senator. And I've always respected his views, and I'm also pleased that he holds the position he holds now. But I think this is one that I believe that several legal organizations are trying to think about. How can they produce lawyers to represent many of the individuals involved? And I think part of that will happen. Again, I have followed Mark Elias and Democracy Forward. I have followed efforts that are being made by Norm Eisen and others, the Brennan Center, other organizations, and are also engaged. It's taking some time to develop, to the point that was asked of me earlier. This doesn't always happen overnight, because you're trying to get volunteers, you're trying to break down silos between different groups to get them to collaborate and things of that type. But I think I am very hopeful there will be a dramatic increase in the number of attorneys and groups that will be prepared to represent individuals who have standing. But I know this is maybe in the weeds, and I don't totally understand it, but the standing issue is a big one. This is where the attorneys general usually have standing to bring these actions. Individual citizens, unions, and other groups will have to establish that they have been harmed. And I'm sure there are many more enlightened class action attorneys in this audience than I am, but I think that's slowly developing right now. That is not my immediate concern, nor I should say, and I can't speak for the Board of Lawyers Defending American Democracy, but our challenge right now, frankly, is to do a lot of collecting of information so people can collaborate, so people can work together, try to and do this across a party line. This is why the Judge Ludwig Society for Rule of Law is a very important organization. It's why the bar associations are important. That you you get people who are of different philosophical backgrounds, but their focus together, working together, is on this rule of law. And I think we still have, I am still very impressed with the faith of most Americans in our court system. I think that can be evaporated. I think that there are some of us who were on maybe the other side of many of the prosecutions, the Jack Smith issue and things like that, that disappointed and that they didn't come to fruition. But every lawyer knows litigation is not always a fast solution. It may be a long-term one, but in the short term, I personally believe that litigation works best in support of active, engaged citizen groups. It was frankly why the tobacco suit was particularly successful, at least in Massachusetts as a leader. We were, for once in time, the Attorney General was actually supporting a public policy already established by corporations and citizens. And when you get that, then litigation is a very powerful tool. It can also be a powerful tool independently, but in support of organized groups who help find plaintiffs, who help find attorneys, who make it clear to attorneys that pro bono work will be rewarded and helpful. We should not kid ourselves. Being quiet, staying behind closed doors at this point, as tempting as it is, particularly for those of us that, if you will, have seen better years, this is the time to come out off the sidelines, as John Gardner said, and enter the fray.
You had mentioned earlier that we've lost local democracy. And how to reclaim that engagement at the local level, and what role can lawyers play in that process?
Well, first of all, at the local level, citizen groups can make a huge difference. Every one of us knows from the towns we live in, whether it's on the Cape at the town meetings, whether it's Floridians here particularly know. Now, I can see that Jim and others of you who have engaged in this noble venture, an important venture in Florida, have wounds and are suffering. But don't kid yourself that staying in the fray doesn't matter. On local issues, on permitting, on those kind of things, that's where you can have the most direct influence. People, and that's also where you educate young people about where they can make a difference. I mean, in my experience, most people who, well, I can't say this most, many people who end up becoming elected officials at high levels start at the local level. They are the school committee members. They are the city council members. They are the town meeting people. They serve in those roles and gradually move up. And this is where people who want to engage in campaigns can help them. I mean, I've always used to say that any person for a school committee in most of the towns in Massachusetts, with few of the large city exception, if you could get 20 kids to door knock for you, you'd win. Just 20 kids, you'd win, just because of the ability to reach out to friends and neighbors. As ironic, I know this is straight, but dear friend cards, the stuff that Floridians for Democracy have been doing to just keep hope alive, is the kernel here that really matters. And I really do believe it may be hard to see how you're going to have impact nationally, but it's easy to see how you can have an impact, or at least feel you're having an impact as a group locally. And that I would encourage. That goes back as far as de Tocqueville. It goes back to every grassroots political organization that's ever been created. It's getting local people engaged. And I think that's what we have to. And a lot of our job now is as Karen was mentioning earlier, it's education. it's showing people how you can do this, that you can do it, that you're not alone, that people do share your view. And it also gives you the opportunity to cross party lines at the local level. People, whatever they have issues, they're concerned about local issues, and they can work together as a result. And that is another lesson to learn that can perhaps be developed into more things later on.
Do you see a role for the lawyers in that effort as far as maybe helping
Yes.
people understand the loss of the rule of law and the impact on their daily lives?
Very much. And I simply refer people to the Lawyers Defending American Democracy website. We have published an entire democracy commitment that we've asked lawyers and bar associations to consider implementing. And the primary issue is for lawyers to participate in panels, to talk about civil discourse, to engage in being available, to help people, lawyers running for office. And I know that, there's a lot of jokes about us lawyers. I understand that. But I do think that that so many of the issues have legal aspects, that lawyers running for office can make a big difference, but also lawyers on panels, on community forums, on various issues. Lawyers engaged in the local level can make a huge difference, because I still think in most communities, lawyers who have a standing, lawyers have a standing. They have a privilege, they have a standing, and they have a base. And that's why I think lawyers can be and should be enlisted. And that's what we're trying to do, is to urge lawyers, not only at the national level and appellate cases and amicus briefs and ethics complaints, but at the local level, to get involved in local issues, particularly and not just be blue states and red states. Even if you are if you're in a blue state, part of the problem is maybe everybody seems to agree with each other, but that's first is not true. And the second part is, but there are perfectly decent people who happen to have been who have been elected. It's just that I'm afraid sometimes we have ignored the opportunity to engage with them and try to find out what their issues are, what we could do together. Are there a core of things? That was to me, with my friend Joe Malone that was mentioned in my introduction. It was true with attorneys general. You didn't agree on everything by any means, but you could disagree without being disagreeable, and you could also find common ground on whether it was consumer issues or business issues, or simply on various things where you had common interests. And that built the relationships for working together on other things.
Great. Thank you. This is a targeted question that has been asked. What do you believe the Supreme Court will do regarding the firing of Hampton Dellinger, head of the Special Counsel Office?
I have no idea. I mean, it still surprises me that, and this one I will put back on our lawyers. I was surprised at how silent we were. Now, Lawyers Defending American Democracy did some stuff about this, but when inspectors general, which were created to have an independent review of every agency, which were not usually selected based on their politics, but on their competence, and were embedded in organizations, and they were created with independent congressional sort of support, because the idea was this would be eyes and ears, independent in the bureaucracy. Maybe they all didn't do their job. Obviously, Elon Musk and others think that none of it was necessary. But I think it was one of the real values to any agency and bureaucracy that almost all of us created in our organizations some level of independent person who could be independent eyes and ears, be an independent voice. How the Supreme Court will view this, it may be a matter of labor law and employment law that I am not an expert in. I would, just like I wonder about what if it was Danielle Sassoon or the other assistant U.S. attorney who had clerked for Roberts or clerked for Scalia, will that matter to judges on the court today, that people that they obviously picked, respect, and respect them, have taken these positions that sadly we view as heroic, because in the case of Danielle, that here was somebody who simply demonstrated total professionalism and integrity, and in this day and age, that makes you a hero. And I just think there are many, many more people like that who are around. So I just don't know, Bill. I would be presumptuous of me to say I am hopeful they will not uphold it, because it is a precedent for eliminating a whole branch of independent review of every agency and bureaucracy, regardless of party, in the circumstances.
Another question about the movement to make our nation a Christian nation. Do you think this will end up in the Supreme Court? And if so, how?
I don't know the answer, how that is being developed and coming. I know that there's a lot of support about that. I also happen to find Tim Alberta's book, Kingdom, Power, and Glory, to be a powerful, powerful commentary on certain parts of this issue of Christian nationalism and others. I also, as somebody who is a member of a UCC church, or at least a member of the Church of the Brethren, find it to be a total anathema in relation to what I understood to be the social gospel and what I understand the Beatitudes and lots of provisions in the New Testament as well as the Old Testament to be. So I am not surprised it's coming back, because the growth, and I am not an expert, but the growth in church development is happening in outside established religion, just like in many other parts of our society. And people feel they're under attack, and that somehow or other they're staving off an assault on Christianity. I don't want to go a whole lot further. I have fairly strong views about it. I think it is a perversion of the Christian social gospel and doctrine, as well as the Old Testament, but that's my view.
Okay, Scott, you've been very generous with your time. I just have one more question, then I'm going to turn it over to Jim and Karen. They may have a couple more questions as well, but this is about marches. You talked several times in your responses about organizing marches. And are you aware of one or more organizations that do a great job at organizing marches, and can they be effective in this MAGA world that we seem to be in?
Boy, that's a good question. And I now refer you to two of my primary sources, Robert Hubble and his Substack, and he regularly identifies local organizations. I grant that he has decided that the Democratic position is the one right now that preserves democracy, and therefore LD lawyers defending American democracy takes no particular position on that, because we are nonprofit. But I think that a guy like Robert Hubble, regularly, almost daily, provides information on local organizations, local activities. He has recently been identifying protests and marches. Secondly, I know that Jamie Raskin is similarly taking that position. And so I think and it has the other benefit, which I mentioned earlier, and I apologize for going on longer than you intended here, of bringing people together out of away from social media together to work together to do something. Now, it does invite in this day and age, as I was saying to a friend who's proposed a March on Washington for lawyers, which in the old days we did in the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights War. It does inviting others who oppose that to get much more engaged, perhaps in violence. I don't know that, but I think so many of these, I think the more that we can get now visibly engage in a peaceful, non-violent way around issues that matter to people in that community or individuals, or in support of people who are heroes in this system, who are standing up or were affected or a victim or are victims of this. I think it's very important. If nothing else, it sends a signal that we're not going to take this lying down. You may win, you may get ahead of us, but we're not going peacefully into this good night. And I think that is a very important message. And I'm not saying Floridians for Democracy ought to make sure you're marching all over the place. I do want to say, though, that I think for those that are on this, whether they're from Florida or not, I hope that you support in whatever way you can uh, Jim and Karen and the Floridians for Democracy, because I think they are speaking truth to power in a way that desperately needs to occur and gives many, many people here a potential home that in many respects they feel where they feel alone. And that is a very important gift.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott. And Jim, I'll turn it over to you.
Jim there.
Can you unmute, Jim?
Yep.
Maybe he's having trouble unmuting.
While he's on mute, let me just say this. I thank all the participants, many people I know, many I don't. I thank you very much for your attention. I welcome comments, suggestions, and I'll urge you also do my pitch for the Lawyers Defending American Democracy website. Jim, I took your space there. Go ahead.
Can you still hear me?
I can.
I don't know what happened to Jim.
He obviously looks like he's trying over there. Maybe you should do the wrap, Bill.
Okay, there's been several questions around how do we organize and how do we keep the pressure going, and I think that's going to be something we're going to take to heart at the Floridians for Democracy. And the response that we've got from everybody here has been overwhelming, and we will continue to have sessions like this going forward. So, Scott,
you ought to tout Bob Schaefer's coming up. Don't forget.
Yes, that's right. Coming up next week.
Yep.
And please go to FloridiansForDemocracy.org.
Thank you.
And check out the time and place and register for the event for next week. It's going to be a really good opportunity for us to keep the conversation going. Thank you, Scott, and thank you for Jim and Karen for hosting us today. And I'm sure
Thank
after we go off, we'll figure out what happened to him as well. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. Thank
Everybody
you.
have a
Thank
good
you very much.
evening.